welcome to the 3D Blu-ray Bunker. This is a place for us die-hard fans of 3D where we exclusively look at 3D Blu-rays, not to review the film but to almost entirely focus on the quality of the 3D on offer, with just a short comment at the end about the film itself. And today we're looking at the 2015 disaster movie San Andreas, starring Dwayne Johnson, who I think may have starred in more 3D releases than anyone else, although I believe he's only actually seen a 3D camera on just one of those films, which was Journey to the Mysterious Island, and that in fact was made by the same director as this one, Brad Peyton, but so the 3D here is post-converted. This is a film whose 3D I'd class as being very good overall, although there are perhaps a couple of areas where it's less impressive than elsewhere. Firstly, it's not overly keen on pop-out shots, something that it only does a few times, and I think all but about 2 or 3 of these are of the very brief sort of blink and you'll miss it types, such as this car door that's falling towards us, or this bit where a load of shattered glass comes flying out of the screen. There's nothing wrong with either of these, but as is just so often the case, I don't think that a few frames is really long enough for a 3D pop-out shot to be properly effective. And maybe the filmmakers thought the same thing, as there are 2 or 3 other obvious ones, which are of the much slower variety, like these ropes, which are rock solid, and in a shot that's held for long enough to really see them jut out of the screen quite a long way. And there are a couple of other pops that perhaps are both a little bit out of place to my mind, as neither of them are necessarily dramatic moments. So, here for example, there's a taxiing aeroplane sticking its nose right out of the screen, and slightly odder than that, there's a television camera that moves towards us and comes quite far into negative parallax. I'm certainly not complaining about either shot, they're both fun, but I think both could attract the criticism of being gimmick shots, and really hand on heart I would find it a little bit hard to disagree with that. But don't think that I'm anti-gimmicky 3D for one moment, because one of my favourite shots in the film is both a pop-out gimmick and it's one that lasts for really just a few frames, but it's a very funny shot, which you might not be quite able to see here, that it's a shoe. In fact, a quick point of interest, this screen grab is from the 2D version of the Blu-ray, and the shot here is totally different than the one on the 3D version, where it's been completely redone, where the shoe is much larger and more obvious. Anyway, so it's a shoe, which in this case is actually a piece of symbolism that comes flying out of the screen, and it's kind of hilarious as it happens during the last we see of one particular character, in a moment that really shouldn't be funny but is clearly played for some satisfying humour, which is fine in this case, and I thought it was really funny, which it was definitely meant to be. The other thing that I think this conversion doesn't do quite as well as some of the best of them is to create believable 3-dimensional faces. They almost always look fairly flat, and sometimes, like in this shot, when they change the angle of the face during the shot, they look slightly off, as if the 3D doesn't look quite right. So the introduction of the hero at the beginning is a really nice shot of Dwayne Johnson as he turns his head towards us from out of the sun with his "just doing my job, ma'am" line, full of his normal charisma. And when I say that's a nice reveal, it's a great shot in 2D, but it's a relatively lifeless piece of 3D. And it's moments like this where I always think that if you're making a 3D film, and if 3D is any kind of priority, then these are the shots that should be richer in their stereoscopic effect. As ever, I'm not for a second suggesting that Brad Peyton did it wrong. It's just my opinion on not necessarily how it would have been better, but how I would have preferred it to look. Given the movie's story, you might expect the film to be full of debris, which it is, and it's often very nicely 3-dimensional, like here, you've got flying between these collapsing buildings, there are lots of bits of rubble falling down, and there's plenty of depth and separation in between them. There's quite a few scenes like this, and even before the earthquake hits, there's the opening scene with the car from earlier crashing, which has got some really nice 3D debris effects as well. There are a handful of noticeably Hypose Stereo cityscape shots, which are all nice, even if they're not quite as strong as I'd like, since Hypose Stereo landscape shots are my personal favourite type of 3D. They're all pleasant enough though, and I was really impressed with this one, where they managed to put the clouds into a really strong 3D space, which makes for a really good shot, and it's also always fun to see lens flare given a good 3D treatment like it is here. And this shot of the Hoover Dam is quite nice too, maybe some miniaturization effect from it being a Hypose Stereo, but that's great. I love these views of the world that can only exist in 3D pictures and films, but of course aren't at all possible in reality. There's some strong 3D in more intimate moments too, and another one of the film's best 3D moments I think is this one at the climax, where the whole point of the scene is the physical barrier in between the two characters, and I think this is a great example of 3D being a huge help to the story, as the depth behind and in front of the glass barrier creates a really strong sense of space and distance, and I think it's brilliantly effective here. As well as Hypose Stereo, I'm also a fan of what's known in stereoscopic photography as Hypose Stereo, so that's a very small interaxial, far less than human eye separation, and I think that's the effect that's been achieved here, in a shot that I suspect is of really little interest to many people, but I love the depth that's been clearly created in these little gauges. It's a shot that I think they could have easily not bothered to do much with, and no one really would have cared, but I for one love stuff like this. There are several other moments where they seem to have worked overtime on creating really strong 3D for shots that you might not normally expect to be given so much effort, like these excellent views in the lecture theatre where it's pushed very strongly, and I'm not quite sure how what looks like a pretty blatant bit of product placement here allowed that one rogue Sony Vaio to slip in amongst an orchard of lookalike laptops. Anyway, there's a reverse view in this scene, which has even stronger 3D here, which I thought was another one of the film's really pleasant 3D treats, where someone decided to go very strong with the effect for no apparent reason other than, why not? It looks great. And like that opening reveal of Dwayne Johnson, there's another moment where I'm going to do that absurd thing of saying that I think the filmmakers missed a trick, like I've thought about it for 5 minutes, so must be an expert. But this view of the opened up fault line itself, we only see from above here, and it's not really one of the film's 3D strong points. And for my money, the San Andreas fault is the movie's monster, if you like, and seeing as the hero is a pilot, who we've already seen can fly his helicopter in some fairly dangerous and, I'm no pilot, but what looked to me like some slightly ridiculous places, so I'd have thought they could have found an excuse to get him to fly the thing through that fault line and, in doing so, give us a spectacular 3D shot of it from within. Now, that might sound like a stupid idea, fair enough, but it does lead me to mention, for the most part, I'm not convinced the film was actually shot with a great deal of thought for 3D. I could be very wrong there, but other than a few shots, this looks to me pretty much how I would expect it to look if it had been created purely for 2D. I'm not suggesting that the 3D necessarily suffers because of that. Overall, I think this is a really good conversion, but there are very few moments where you might think it was framed with 3D specifically in mind, although possibly to immediately counter that suggestion, most of the aircraft shots are very nicely framed to keep the flying machines entirely within the frame, which is definitely beneficial to the 3D. And on the subject of the helicopter, here's a moment where it isn't in the frame, but there is some really impressive depth created beneath its blades to the ground below, and that looks really clever to me. In fact, it's a really nice effect. Something I know I mention a lot because it's always so pleasing to me is how effective top-down shots can be in 3D. And there's an early one that comes in that opening car crash, when it gets precariously lodged down the ravine here. And even though that scene of the car crashing maybe looked like it had some slightly wonky physics to it, this is a nice view where the depth in the 3D helps to make us feel the height of the peril. Here's another great one. Clearly it's got strong lines of perspective, which I think help to intensify the effect, but it's also obviously a dramatic moment where we're scared by the massive drop beneath Carla Gugino, and I think this was one of the film's standout 3D bits. Another really good top-down view is this one of some destroyed buildings. It's the view down skyscrapers that can often be incredibly powerful, and this is a good one. But before the chaos kicks in, the film gives us what is my favourite shot in the whole movie. It's this view here, which is absolutely stunning. It's a strong Hypose Stereo shot, and there's every chance I'm wrong about this, but I think it's possible that this shot is actually native 3D. So whilst it was shot with a single camera tracking from left to right, it could have been created by taking the right eye view always several frames ahead of the left eye view, and obviously just using a bit of digital trickery to sort out anything that had moved in between those frames, like the cars. This is something that you can do with any 2D film on shots where the camera moves from one side to another across a static backdrop. I remember doing it from the original DVD release of The Two Towers to create what I thought at the time was a really good photo of the Golden Hall of Edoras, which reminds me that if it hadn't been for 3D falling out of favour, we'd very probably have some 3D Blu-rays now of the Lord of the Rings trilogy, because I vaguely recall Peter Jackson stating his intention around the time of The Hobbit to do that. Anyway, like I say, that might not be what they've done here at all. It could just have been done using the standard conversion techniques, but it does seem to me like the obvious and easy way to have created the 3D here, and either way, it's a really spectacular view. So, a very quick word on the film itself. This is a big, dumb disaster movie. It's fairly formulaic stuff, with the large-scale destruction being used to bring an estranged family back together. Not exactly original, but I enjoyed it enormously. It's spectacular in its depiction of devastation, and it's got a bunch of very likeable characters, as well as the old obligatory unlikable one. All the actors doing a good job, and I thought it was great fun. There's a sort of A story and a B story, the first one being about Dwayne Johnson's rescue pilot and his family, and the second one is was about Paul Giamatti's seismologist and his earthquake prediction model, which I'm going to assume is scientific gibberish. And I was maybe just a tiny bit disappointed that these two story elements never actually meet up, because it seemed pretty clear to me at some point they would. Ewan Grufford he's fun as the nasty piece of work, and from a personal point of view, even though the actor Hugo Johnston-Burt is actually an Aussie, I also particularly like the fact that the bumbling and awkward English character got to enjoy the very three-dimensional charms of Alexandra Daddario. And speaking of Australians, it was a little bit odd to see Kylie Minogue turn up in the film in what felt like a rather insignificant role. Just because it was filmed in Queensland doesn't seem like a reason to shoehorn in a part for her, but she did a good job as the nasty piece of work's equally nasty sister. And of course, Dwayne Johnson is always entirely believable and enjoyable as the utterly capable and dependable hero of the piece. So, with its enjoyable presentation of a catastrophe, and for its solid and effective 3D, which was done by Stereo D, by the way, I would certainly recommend this one for your 3D Blu-ray collection. So I hope you found this in some way useful, and if so, I hope you'll join me again soon for another 3D Blu-ray review. Until then, thanks for looking in on this one. Cheers for now. Bye-bye.